Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here with a large damp square-headed brush. I'm beginning by applying a mixture of titanium white and primary blue to the middle of the canvas. Then I'm taking additional primary blue and applying that around our initial application. Now I'm blending the two together fairly softly. The goal is to render a smooth gradient, one fairly void of brush strokes and impressions. This is generally best done by using a very soft touch of the brush. It's also worth noting that if you're having troubles with the blend and rendering something fairly smooth, I'd simply implore you to incorporate a little bit more water into your mixture, and it should make the process a whole lot easier. Once I have the sky the way I want it, I'm going to go and grab my medium-sized round-headed brush, and on it there is a bit of titanium white and primary blue. I'm going to begin mapping in my clouds at the bottom, and I'm doing so with a circular motion with my brush. I'm trying to ensure that my clouds are always evolving and changing. I also want the edge of the cloud to be fairly sharp, and then I blend the pigment down backwards and it slowly dissipates and creates yet another gradient. I'm doing this on both sides of my canvas in an attempt to kind of frame my sky. Now this can be done with the round-headed brush because the round-headed brush innately has a fairly feathered edge. It's rounded, so you don't get a lot of sharp lines like you would with the square-headed brush. Here I'm switching over to my smaller round-headed brush and I'm creating some smaller clouds in the top. This one's better for the detail work. Now it's also worth noting that when you're doing a painting like this and there's a large sky, you probably don't want to do the same cloud over and over, or even the same type of cloud. So here you can see that there are different types of clouds. As we get higher, they get a little bit more wispy, and they get smaller. They also get directional. So they kind of act as leading lines and bring you from one side of the painting over to the other. This also creates a bit of a frame and a border, so the viewer and the eye never leave the painting through the left or right-hand side, because they're always following that bright cloud with their eye, which leads them back down into the middle of the painting where you want it, because the eye will innately go to the brightest portion in the painting. So here you can see that I'm just going back and I'm touching up a couple of these clouds. If the paint's still a little bit wet and your brush is also a little bit wet, you can always go back and change things, and it's great when you do it with clouds because it'll make them a little bit more transparent, and that's great to do around the edges. From there, I'm going to incorporate a bit of a light here in the center of the sky, and this is going to be cast from the shooting star, which we are about to apply. For this shooting star, I'm using a pure titanium white. I'm ensuring the head of it is incredibly bright, and then as it trails off, that brightness dissipates and becomes more of the color of the sky because it's more transparent. Then I'm switching over to my larger square-headed brush and I'm beginning to map in where I want my water to be. I'm doing so with a litany of horizontal strokes, and I'm beginning by applying a very bright blue. This is where the reflection of the shooting star is going to be predominantly. Then on both sides of it, I'm applying more of a primary blue and I'm blending the two together. However, the blend isn't being done in a very soft manner like we did in the sky. It's more created through this repetition of horizontal strokes, as you can see here. So I'm doing it on both sides. I'm trying to create a nice gradient, and I'm also creating a bit of a pattern as well. Now, I know what you're thinking. We're going down and we're working on the water, but the sky, it doesn't look like it did in the thumbnail. It doesn't look finished. And that's because it really isn't just yet. We need to let that dry before we can go in and add additional highlights. Otherwise, the pigment can get a little bit muddy and it'll just blend a little bit too much. We won't get those stark highlights we want. So when you're painting with acrylics, sometimes you do need to just give it a minute and then come back to it. And that's exactly what we're doing up in the sky. In the meantime, you can see that I'm kind of refining the reflection down in the water area as well. I'm doing that with a smaller brush now. This is our medium-sized square-headed brush. It has the same shape as the previous brush, and it's fantastic. It just renders a little bit of additional detail. Much like how we switched from the medium-sized round-headed brush in the sky and the clouds to the smaller one, we're doing the same now here with the square-headed brush. Now, from there, I'm going to begin working on my mountains, and I'm starting with the ones in the distance. These mountains aren't going to be the innate color of a mountain, though. They're going to be more so a combination of that color and the reflected light that surrounds them. In this case, that is a lot of blue. Generally, when subjects are very far away in paintings and landscapes, they adopt a lot more of the colors of the atmosphere, and this helps interject a lot of depth into your painting. So that's really what we're doing right here. We're ensuring that the tops of them are also a little bit more highlighted. Now, I would like to apologize. I did miss a little bit of a clip. My camera stopped recording, but you need not fear because I did order a new camera and that shouldn't be an issue in the near future. What you did miss was the application of a little bit of gray on the tops of my mountains. It was only about 12-13 seconds, but as you can see, we just applied a gray to the top and then spread it downwards. However, the bottoms of the mountains are still quite dark, and that was intentional. We wanted the gradient from the light to the dark. This is going to interject a little bit of depth into our mountains, and it's really going to help. Because the light from the atmosphere from the shooting star, it can surround itself very easily around the top of the mountain, but not so much the bottom. So that's really what you need to consider. How much light is going to get to each part of your subject. Now, I'm also going back into these mountains with a smaller square-headed brush and a lot of titanium white paint. This brush is dry, so when I apply it, I get more of a speckled effect. It isn't a smooth application. I'm applying a very small amount of pressure, and I just want this jagged, gritty looking effect. Now, the square-headed brush is fantastic for rendering mountains and this sort of thing because it has a sharp edge. And brushes with sharp edges are best for rendering subjects with sharp edges. We use the round-headed brush in the clouds because it has a soft edge. So different brushes work better in different scenarios, and it's important to know which one you should use in each. However, they are interchangeable, and if you find you have a preference that's different than what I would implore you to do, then I'd actually implore you to go with your gut and do what you find works best. Because painting is subjective, and you know what? We all do things a little bit differently from time to time, and that is a-okay. Here you can see that I'm just creating some pathways in my mountains, and I'd also like to note that all of your mountains should look slightly different from the one next to them. This is nature, it isn't man-made, and you do want all of these to have their own intricacies, pathways, sizes, and shapes. They also should kind of connect to each other in different ways as well. Now from there I'm switching over to my smaller round-headed brush and I'm beginning to incorporate the highlights in the clouds. Like I said, I wanted to do this from the start. However, I needed to allow my clouds to dry before I went in and did this. Otherwise, the brighter pigments would have been diluted and lost. So we're really applying this around the edges of the clouds in the areas where I feel the most light will be cast upon them. So it's not in the far back areas, it's more so along the edges that are closest to the shooting star. These pigments are best applied here with a good amount of water on your brush because you're going to want to blend them back and you're going to want a very smooth transition and gradient in that transition. You don't want it to look gritty, especially not in your clouds. That's a very soft subject. Now, this series is aimed to be 10 minutes. However, it's really hard to put down the brush. These are a lot of fun to make. And so, as per usual, while this is what it looks like around the 10-minute mark, I did have some additional ideas. I wanted to share them with you. So I filmed that, I sped it up, and I wanted to show you an extra minute and a half full of other little pieces you can incorporate into your painting. But that is our simple 10-minute version. Now we're going to jump into the 11-ish minute version. So I'm going to begin here by simply adding in some additional highlights and details into the clouds in the sky. Then I'm throwing in some stars. I didn't incorporate these initially because I was kind of concerned that they might take away from the shooting star. However, it can also add a nice additional intricate detail. From there, I'm just going in and I'm adding some additional texture into the foreground and some highlights on the mountains. Acrylic paints innately dry a little bit darker, a little bit more transparently, so sometimes you have to go back in and work in additional highlights in these sort of things. Here you can see I'm doing the same thing in the background, but I'm not using as stark of a color. I'm kind of letting the background be a little bit more muted, as that will help with the depth in the painting. But with all of that being said, there we have our 11-ish minute painting. If you like this and you'd simply like to learn more about acrylic painting, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you'd like hour-long lessons just like this, where I also show you my color palettes, how I'm blending and mixing paint, there is a link in the description to my Patreon where you can check that out as well. With that being said, I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching, and above all, as always, stay creative.